Okay, try recording this presentation. This is a presentation made to Research Ed Cymru back at the end of February. We're battling our way through Storm Georgie to get there. Long forgotten now, it's all coronavirus and COVID-19. So here we go. It's called Making Sense of Donaldson's 12 Pedagogical Principles. Basically, it's a presentation about teaching. And just to whet your appetite, I've got a teaching clip for you to watch. So here we go.
In 1930, the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, in an effort to alleviate the effects of the the Great Depression, passed the the tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression. Today, we have a similar debate over this. Anyone know what this is, class? Anyone? Anyone seen this before? The Laffer curve. Anyone know what this says? It says that at this point on the revenue curve, you will get exactly the same amount of revenue as at this point. This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Okay, great clip there. One of my favourite films. Anyone know the title? Anyone? Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It was the biggest grossing film in which year? 1984 or 1985? Anyone? 1985. Great stuff there. So, a bit of a caricature of teaching there from the 1980s. Bill Stein was the actor there. Some great performances. Just want you to hold that thought. We'll touch back on it every now and again during the presentation. Okay, so let's move forward. Successful futures. What's that got to say about teaching? Have a read of this. So it's on page 63, very sensible stuff. Decisions about teaching and learning are very context and purpose specific and are best taken by teachers themselves. So obviously teachers know their stuff, they know what they're teaching, they know their class. Really they're best placed to make the decisions about teaching. Doesn't always happen though. Okay, moving on through Successful Futures, they introduced the 12 pedagogical principles. Big shout out to Impact Wales here for their presentation of the 12 pedagogical principles. Now, I must admit, when I see these, I do get a bit confused. Think about nearly 30 years in teaching and do wonder what they all mean in their entirety. But looking at these, there's one in particular that I'm very interested in, and it's going to be the focus of this presentation: employing a broad repertoire of teaching approaches. So, repertoire of teaching approaches, also referred to sometimes as blended teaching. You've got to be careful you don't confuse that with blended learning, which is a mixture of online lessons and face-to-face teaching. It's certainly not that. It's a repertoire of teaching approaches. So in Successful Futures, it unpacks it a bit more on page 65. Talks about it, good teaching and learning employing a blend of approaches, including direct teaching. And just read that. Donaldson goes on to say, let's give you a second to read that. So Donaldson highlights that debate we often get between traditional and discovery learning or constructivism, people taking polarized positions, and he talks about the risk in direct teaching being caricatured as didactic whole class instruction. And just taking back to the video clip from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, that was a caricature of teaching, direct teaching in its most boring form, which is often used to discredit direct teaching approaches, sage on the stage and all that type of stuff. Okay, so being a mathematician, big fan of data, what's big information? What's the big data say, the big surveys. So picked out some of the biggest surveys that have taken place in education. Got 4 of them here really for you. Got Project Follow Through from the US back in the 60s and 70s. Hattie's visible learning research, meta-analysis of thousands of research studies. What makes great teaching from the Sutton Trust, and obviously PISA, big surveys, run about 500,000 pupils in each one. What do they have to say on this matter? So let's start with Project Follow Through. As it says there, it was the largest education survey ever undertaken. Total cost around £1 billion. And the aim was to break the cycle of poverty through better education. The government at the time realised they had a big challenge on their hands. They could see people from poor backgrounds, particularly blacks and Hispanics, were doing poorly in the American education system, and they wanted to try and solve the problem. And what do Americans do? They spend money. So they set up Project Follow Through to evaluate all the different systems out there and find out what's the best, and then it'd be huge wad of money really to follow through and promote successful strategies. So there were 9 models generally tested, which fell into 3 broad camps. Basic skills, and that was really behaviours needed to be learnt by explicit teaching, so more direct teaching approaches. Cognitive conceptual skills approaches, so sort of learning through problem solving activities with the view of developing cognitive and verbal skills. And affective skills, this was an emphasis on improving children's self-esteem, peer interactions through pupil-led activities, so the teacher acts as a facilitator. And here are the results from the survey, which took 10 years in the making, over 200,000 pupils. They measured in green there, you can see the pupils' abilities in the basic skills, so it's really language and mathematics, the cognitive ability, the ability to solve problems, and the affective was their self-esteem. So what do they feel about themselves? And you can see the different models across here. And there was one clear winner from that massive survey, which showed that direct instruction model was by far the most effective, and that was on all 3 areas measured: the basic skills, the cognitive, and the affective. Generally, the ones which focused on the direct teaching were more successful, and you can see along here the ones which were more open-ended, more teacher as facilitator, were less successful. In fact, sent pupils backwards. Obviously, a 0 here would mean average progress, as you might have expected anyway. So these negative ones have sent pupils backwards. And quite interesting as well, a lot of these ones, team, open education, they were set up to improve self-esteem. But even on the self-esteem, the affective side, they weren't even successful. So what happened with the results from this? It was really fascinating, really. So, clear winner from the data. So when the results came out, the American government announced that there was no overall winner, and that all the models were equally successful. And so what did they do with the big wad of follow-through money? They sort of sprinkled it across all the different models and promoted them, almost in an attempt to make the less effective ones more effective. It's a great example of what you call the Semmelweis effect. It's a tendency to reject new evidence or knowledge because it contradicts established norms, beliefs, or paradigms. So in this case, the education establishment couldn't really stomach that direct instruction was far more effective than a discovery, pupil-led type approaches. And we still think we see that in the system today. Okay, moving on, visible learning. Hattie's research identified the following high-impact evidence-based teaching strategies. So direct instruction again, space practice, that's leaving gaps between topics to revisit them, teaching metacognitive skills, thinking about the process of learning, reciprocal teaching, that's teacher does a bit, pupil does a bit, flipping, also pupil, concept mapping, obviously mapping out different concepts, ability to take notes and other study skills, good habits, quality of feedback, teaching problem solving skills, so making the process explicit, mastery learning, So that's mastering certain things before you move on to high-level content and worked examples. Also, Hattie provided a good definition of direct teaching, so I'll give you a couple of seconds to read that. So basically what you've got there, you've got clear learning intentions, a process of explaining and practice for the pupils, retelling and summarising with some closure. It's a fairly simple teaching approach. Okay, also from Hattie's visible learning, we got to see sort of things that didn't have so much impact either. You can see down the bottom there, student control over learning, similar to project follow-through. Interestingly as well, you can see here that you've got problem-based learning, low impact, but then on the right-hand side, in the green area, teaching problem-solving, high impact. So again, similar to project follow-through, those models that just tried to use problems to develop cognitive skills didn't really work. So just chucking problems at pupils doesn't appear to work. But if you teach problem solving, you make it explicit, that does appear to have a high impact. Now I've got something here, it's not actually from Hattie's research, it's from the Singapore maths curriculum actually. Problem solving skills run through their curriculum like a stick of rock. They call them heuristics. And as an ex-head of maths, I always think we did do a lot of these things, but we didn't make them explicit enough. We should have gone after them more. So here they are on the left hand side, things like drawing a diagram, a model, breaking problems down, things that are pretty obvious, I suppose. Guess and check, trial and improvement. I mean, that is a classic problem-solving strategy. You think of square roots, square root 200. Oh, we're not sure about that. We'll have a guess. 10. 10 times 10 is 100. Too low. Okay, let's try 20. 20 times 20 is 400. Oh, gone too high now. Go in between. 15. 15 times 15, 225. Getting closer. 14 times 14, 196, only 4 away, so just over 14. So that refining, getting closer, and of course you can use that problem-solving approach in making a recipe. Try the recipe, or do you put too much salt, not enough stock, or whatever it happens to be. Try it again, refine it till you get better, making a product as well. And of course that's iteration, a really important computer programming process as well. Being systematic, listing, ordering, grouping, working backwards, another very effective strategy. Always reminds me of the Make 24 game, very popular at the end of the 90s in maths departments. I remember being in a heads of maths meeting and one problem had come up and the heads of maths couldn't solve it. Just talk you through what the Make 24 is. You get 4 numbers and you've got to use the 4 operations to make 24. You've got to use every number as well. So for example, if you had 5, 5, 5 and 5 as your numbers, how are you going to make 24? Well, 5 times 5, 25. 5 divided by 5 is 1. 25 minus 1 gets you to 24. So you've got that. And this particularly hard problem was 2 7s and 2 3s. And this is a great example of where the working backwards works really, really well. So you take the 24, divide it by the 7, that gives you 3 and 3/7. So we can do 3 divided by 7 to give us 3/7. Add on the other 3 to make 3 and 3/7, and then times it by the 7 takes us back to 24. So, very efficient way of making yourself looking very clever by working backwards. Things like looking for patterns, obviously, by putting things in tables and graphs, generalizing and using algebra, restating problems and thinking of related problems. So, a great set of techniques to help the problem-solving process. Okay, and out of Hattie's visible learning, always think back. What was one of the main things that came out of it? There's so much in there, but probably feedback for me as a teacher and a school improvement officer was the main thing. And it seemed to lead to a lot of, written comments in books and, people sort of acting purple, blue, red pens and all this sort of stuff. And actually, when he wrote about the feedback, he talked about oral feedback being much more effective than written feedback. So another lesson of how the system can really get things wrong. That immediate feedback in the class as kids are working, far more effective than all this writing and marking that's been going on and getting things back a week later. Okay, another big study, what makes great teaching? They identified 6 components of great teaching. First 2, these are the strongest evidence of impact. So it's content knowledge, knowing your stuff, and knowing how kids learn your stuff, and the quality of instruction. So in terms of the content knowledge, it's understanding how people think about the subject matter and identifying misconceptions. It's not just knowing your stuff, it's knowing how kids learn it and how that impacts on your teaching. Quality instruction includes things like effective questioning, modelling, scaffolding, assessment, time for practice, all key ingredients of classroom craft. The next 2, which had moderate impact from their research, classroom climate, classroom management. So these included things like quality of interaction between teacher and pupils, teacher's expectation, making sure you've got high expectations and they complete the work to high standards. Classroom management, things like efficient use of lesson time, resources, management of pupil behaviour. All, again, key things. If you haven't got those, the learning is not going to be so good. 2 more they identified of great features: teachers' beliefs and professional behaviours. So the beliefs, why teachers adopt a particular practice and conviction and buy-in. So they do need to believe in things to really make it work. So if you're promoting things they don't believe in, I think you're always going to struggle. And the last one there, professional behaviours. Take that commitment to develop reflection and improve your practice. What makes great teaching also identified some less effective teaching strategies. I'll just let you have a second to have a look at those. Okay, just going to pick out 2 of these, 3, sorry. Grouping learners by ability. Interestingly, Lucy Crahan came to speak to Swansea Heads about a year and a half ago, and she'd looked into the most successful PISA countries, and I think something like 10 out of the 12 most successful countries do not group by ability until about 15, 16 years old. So trying to keep kids together would appear to be an important thing, not letting the gaps grow. Encouraging rereading and highlighting to memorize key ideas. It's not a great approach. Much better to use spacing and retrieval practices, as identified by Hattie there, so space things out rather than and bring them back to strengthen the long-term recall. I love number 7 as well. Ensure learners are always active rather than listening passively. So quiet lessons are okay. You're allowed a quiet lesson. Good news. Okay, update as well due on what makes great teaching from evidence-based education. It's been put back actually at the time. I thought it was going to be March 2020, but it looks like now the report, their update to what makes great teaching from the Sutton Trust is going to come out in June 2020, so something to look out for there. And it's going to include a great teaching toolkit, I believe. So some really interesting stuff there. Okay, I did mention Lucy Crahan visited Swansea Heads back a year and a half ago, and she talked about the PISA 2020 survey, and this is what she shared with us really. This graph here, which shows along the bottom the type of approach that pupils reported they were being taught most often. So towards the right is more traditional teaching. Towards the left is more open-ended, and you can see the middle there is 3, so sort of a ratio of 3 to 1. So people's generally reporting more direct teaching than open-ended. And they map on, you can obviously with PISA, map on all the data, the outcomes that the kids had. And then obviously you've got to see in this graph which countries are more successful and where they were in terms of the types of teaching that pupils were reporting. And The top performers in mathematics are identified in red, and the top ones in creative problem solving in blue. So what Lucy picked out here, there seemed to be a channel in the data here where the countries who were red, the top in maths and in problem solving, seemed to fall. It was round about the sort of the 3 to 4 ratio. So suggesting, it's not an either or, that polarization, one or the other, but that sort of mix of, direct and open-ended at different times as kids are learning and developing their skills. A very sensible approach. Moving on to PISA 2015, of course, these are big surveys. Should have said, talk about 500,000 pupils in these surveys, so you get more reliability with the data, I suppose. This was obviously, science was the main domain, and again they asked kids how they've been taught, and they broke the science teaching down into these elements. You can see in the graph here on the left hand side we've got more direct approaches. So for example, on the extreme left here we've got the teacher explains how a science idea can be applied to a number of different phenomena. And the next one, then the teacher clearly explains the relevance of science concepts to our lives. And the next one, then students are given opportunities to explain their ideas, all making gains. So these pupils report how they were taught, they're linked to their schools, and you can see that those ones who report they were taught more this way had higher outcomes. On the right hand side then sort of moves to more open-ended approaches. The last 3 here, students spend time in the lab doing practical experiments, students are asked to do investigations to test ideas, students are allowed to design their own experiments. So the more open-ended it goes, the more the results decline. But obviously that's not saying that we shouldn't be doing these things, it's the proportion of it. So this pupils were reporting here, they were mostly taught this way, and the more they were taught that way, or the more often they were taught that way, the lower the outcomes. And what was interesting about this from PISA 2015, and this is PISA's own words really, they say, perhaps surprisingly, in no education system do students who reported that they're frequently exposed to inquiry-based instruction score higher in science. So it's without exceptions. Those who were saying they were getting more open-ended teaching than directed were doing weaker. And of course, this takes us back to Project Follow-Through, isn't it? It's a very similar results that we saw. So, Project Follow-Through, the 60s and 70s, we're talking about 40, 50 years ago. We're talking about 4 to 9-year-old pupils doing literacy and numeracy, or English and maths, basically, in problem solving. And then move forward 40, 50 years, the PISA 2015 is science, 14, 50-year-olds. But we're still seeing a very similar pattern. The more direct it was, the more effective, or the stronger, I should say, the outcomes were. Okay, so let's move to a definition of direct teaching. We talked a lot about the outcomes there. Professor Paul Kirschner is a bit of an expert in this area. Open University in the Netherlands. Got a little podcast for you to listen to here. He provides some useful thoughts on what direct teaching is.
Yeah. There are 2 definitions of direct instruction that you can do really very little with, and that you can see that Barak Rosenshine wrote a really nice article about that. And one of them is any academic instruction led by a teacher. It's completely non-specific. Anything led by a teacher. It could be discovery learning led by a teacher, or it could be a lecture led by the teacher. Okay. On those types of definitions, there's absolutely no value. The second definition of direct instruction is kind of pejorative in nature. It's people setting up a typical straw man based upon the idea of lecture and passive listening. It's been, it's authoritarian, it's drill and skill, it's isolated rote fact accumulation, it focuses on tests, it's one size fits all of those types of thoughts about it. It's setting up a straw man, as I said, which is very easy to knock down. But those 2 things aren't what I prefer, aren't what they should be. Direct instruction can be seen at best, according in any event to Barak, as procedures used by effective teachers, And that's kind of like stating your lesson goals, dividing tasks into smaller components, anticipating student efforts and things like that. Errors. Another one are instructional procedures used by teachers when they're teaching cognitive strategies to students. So that's also, again, in the same type of thing, but then you're giving them the tools, the students as it is, the tools and techniques to learn, making use of techniques like distributed practice, retrieval practice, those types of things to achieve the goals. And the third, which is fairly related to that, are the DISTAR, the Engelmann's capital DI, where you give students an explicit step-by-step strategy. You help them to develop mastery at each step in the process. You have specific correction procedures when students make errors. You fade teacher direction as students move forward. You use adequate and systematic practice, and you review the newly learned concept. Those are the 6, I think I got them correctly, the 6 DI. And as you can see, they all have, those last 3 have a lot dealing with the same things, giving feedback, checking things out, anticipating student errors. I think the thing that the commonalities of that, of the 3 better descriptions of direct instruction, are that they are all intended to reduce the difficulty of a task during the initial run of it, the initial practice. So you do things in small steps. You give people the necessary prior knowledge. You provide scaffolds and support to the learners. And that could be through modeling, through giving them worked out examples, to giving them process worksheets, those types of things. You provide good supportive feedback, and feedback often in terms of not direct, a corrective feedback, you did this right or wrong, but more directive feedback as how you could have or should have done it. But even more interesting is what I call epistemic feedback, which is you get students to think about what they did. How did you arrive at this answer? Could you have done it in a different way? Would a different approach have led to a different result or a better result? Those types of things, because you want to get students... Metacognitive. I call it epistemic, but it's metacognitive prompts. Stellan Olson calls it epistemic tasks. Okay? And the fourth thing is providing extensive independent practice. If you add those 4 things together, reducing the difficulty, providing scaffolds and support, providing good feedback, and providing lots of independent practice, you have kind of like the basis of what I would call explicit instruction or direct instruction.
Okay, so some really useful thoughts there from Professor Paul Kirschner. First, he highlights the poor definitions of direct teaching or explicit instruction, anything teacher-led, the old-fashioned teaching rote learning. He calls it the straw man argument. Think back again to the Ferris Bueller Day Off lesson. That's classic straw man stuff, isn't it? It looks absolutely dire, terrible teaching. A lot of people use that just to dismiss it. But then he goes on then to provide a really detailed description of what effective direct instruction is, talking about having those clear learning intentions, breaking tasks down into manageable chunks, anticipating errors and misconceptions. That's really knowing your subject and knowing where kids are going to trip up. The retrieval strategies, revisiting things, spacing and distributed. Again, we saw that from Hattie. Regular feedback, checking for understanding, and including in that focusing on the metacognitive, the how did we do it, how did we learn it. Faded scaffolding, taking away, as the learners get stronger and more independent. Systematic independent practice, and step-by-step mastery of each stage. So making sure you've got fundamental skills, knowledge, concepts before you move too far ahead. And he boils that down, I think, into 4 really nice areas. Reducing difficulties so people can access the content, the scaffolding and support that teachers need to provide to get pupils going, feedback to improve, and plenty of practice. Again, it's fairly simple stuff, isn't it? But if we do those well, it can have big impact. Okay, so coming towards the end here, coming back to Donaldson's 12 pedagogical principles. Well, we focused in here employing a broad repertoire of teaching approaches, and there's an awful lot packed into there. And so hopefully this presentation has been able to unpack that. And I think for me, coming back to the 12 pedagogical principles, in that employing a broad repertoire of teaching approaches, it underpins so many of the other areas, and ultimately, Donaldson's four purposes. Okay, obviously this is a recorded presentation. At the end, always leave a few points for people to think about. So how well is major research evidence on teaching and learning shared in your school department? Looking at those big studies there, how much do we know about them? Are they shared? We should really know about these things, shouldn't we? Number 2, how do we ensure an appropriate balance between direct and open-ended teaching? We looked at the polarization there, the straw man arguments, and it goes on both sides as well. And I think the Lucy Crahan approach there, it's not one or the other, it's a bit of a balance, and it'll be in different stages, different times of learning. It's that sort of nuanced thinking that teachers need to develop and think about. And when a direct teaching strategy is most effective, and when is it more beneficial to use open-ended approaches? So we're not just saying it's one or the other, we're thinking we're going to deploy them at the right time in the best places. Just one more slide to finish on. NFER brought out a survey around about a year ago looking at how well evidence-informed teachers are, and looking at this graph here, you see the 2 with the boxed ones. They're talking about the percentage of staff who reported that their sources of professional learning were based on research and advice, guidance from university or research organisation. So down at the lower end. It's not to say, if you look at this end here, you've got ideas generated by me and my school. Those might be based on research, but still I think it is highlighting that getting research findings, big data, better understanding of what the research is telling us into schools still remains a challenge. Okay, and there's the links for the presentation if people want to follow up and find out a little bit more about what I've been talking about. And that's really it from me, really. So thank you for listening. You've been so much better than the last lot.